We begin this tale in 1998, when few people knew a labor dispute would change the world forever. After months of disagreement, New York and the local Teamsters Union could find no resolution, and so the union voted to go on strike, and with them many of New York City's workers joined the Teamsters on the picket line. The manpower shortage had its desired effect as the city ground to a halt, but as the truckers were on the picket lines, there was no one to bring food into the city, and as the old Roman proverb goes, all civilizations are 3 meals from anarchy. Soon after the strike started, many food riots broke out, with rioters joining with the labor protesters in the streets, causing chaos throughout the New York sprawl. In this volatile environment, a medical corporation called Syrtec, in their infinite wisdom, decided to transport hazardous and infectious materials across town. With the riots raging, the truck drove through the streets of Staten Island, where the rioters mistook it as a food truck, as Syrtec had been running food trucks into the city at this time. It was only a surprise to Syrtec security when the truck was stopped by protesters who demanded what they thought was food. The security detail at first tried to warn off the mob, but soon the events spun out of their control, and a firefight ensued. From this point on, things only got worse, as more Syrtec security forces arrived to clear the way for the truck, and a running gun battle ensued in the streets of New York City. This high-speed chase only ended when the convoy arrived at the Syrtec facility in New Jersey, where they laid siege to the building until dawn the next day. After the smoke had cleared, the body count was staggering. 200 rioters and 20 Syrtec security personnel lay dead. In the aftermath of these horrible events, those in the former U.S. government seemed more concerned with reining in the growing strength of the corporate security forces and the threat they represented to the powers that be than the lives lost, and were fast to use this bloodbath to political advantage, quickly charging and convicting Syrtec with criminal negligence. Syrtec, acting almost as though they planned all this ahead of time, quickly appealed the decision, and it was brought to the U.S. Supreme Court, where Syrtec argued that not only did Santa Clara County versus Union Pacific Railroad 1886 give corporations the right of moral persons, and thus the right of the Second Amendment, but they also had a civic responsibility to protect the public from the hazardous material that was on board their truck that would have caused much more loss of life if the mob had gotten hold of it. In the end, Syrtec won, and the Supreme Court even went as far as to commend Syrtec and their diligent action in saving the people of New York from their own bio-waste that they had carelessly moved to a crowded sprawl while a citywide riot was going on. And thus they laid the groundwork for the megacorporations to defend their profits with lethal force. It was in the year 2000 the first of 2 Supreme Court decisions involving the world's largest and wealthiest corporation of the time, Shiawassee, came down. The corporation was then smelting aluminum in the former United States, which put a strain on the local power grid, causing rolling blackouts in the local area. Due to the public backlash caused by the Syrtec decision and the bloodbath that preceded it a year before, the government was less than helpful in providing the electrical needs for Shiawassee's smelting plant. And the government instituted an electrical usage plan that would prioritize power for the people's use and raise the cost of electricity for high-load commercial use by 550% in order to maintain the power needs of the taxpayers. Shiawassee, finding they needed a new source of power outside of that of the public sector, applied to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or NRC, to build a nuclear reactor for their corporate operations. The very horrified Nuclear Regulatory Commission denied the application wholeheartedly, and with the speedy predictability of corporations, Shiawassee immediately filed for an appeal, and after much legal wrangling wound up in the Supreme Court of the former United States. That summer, Shiawassee successfully argued before the Supreme Court that the government had blocked them from doing business, first by raising the cost of electricity to prohibitive levels, and then denying them permission to build their own power plant to alleviate the strain on the public power grid. The Supreme Court agreed with them, and before the end of the year, Shiawassee had their nuclear power plant up and running. Some of you may be asking how they got their power plant up and running so fast. Well, it turns out Shiawassee had been planning for the Supreme Court ruling all along, and had already started construction long before they had even applied to the NRC. The reactor was built out of country in Singapore, while the housing, vessel, support engineering, and control electronics were built on site without the need of an NRC permit. So after the Supreme Court ruling, they just shipped in the reactor and dropped it into a ready-made structure. Though this court ruling may sound benign, it had dire consequences for the events of the future. As when the governments of the 20th century lost their power, many of their protected natural resources were swallowed up by the growing corporations, causing a rise in ecoterrorism. With its high-profile Supreme Court case, it was no wonder that Shiawassee's power plant within weeks of opening had become a target of what was now known as ecotage. An elite force from the eco-terrorist group known as Terra First had attempted an attack on the power plant within its first weeks of opening, with enough explosives to crack the reactor and its containment structure. Their plan was to sneak past the security cordons and blow the reactor, spreading fallout around the surrounding area. They had successfully bypassed the outer security perimeter, but as they penetrated the inner security cordon, Shiawassee security forces gunned down every last member of the Terra First strike team. This breach of security set the stage for the second Shiawase decision. After the attack, the NRC, capitalizing on the widespread panic and fear caused by the Terra First attack, sued Shiawase for criminal negligence, citing inadequate security. So it was again Shiawase called on their lawyers to do their work, and with much legal wrangling, the corporation ended up in the Supreme Court for the second time in as many years. It has been said by many legal analysts that the NRC's argument was doomed from the start, as before the attack, Shiawase security forces had been forced to incorporate local police forces into the defense of the power plant. This is something the Shiawase lawyers held front and center as they pointed out the inner cordon was adequately defended and the attack repulsed. They also pointed out that the breach only happened due to the incompetency of the government forces manning the outer cordon, and the fact was their security forces were being hamstrung by the restrictions applied to their security forces by the NRC and the local law enforcement that prevented them from interfering with the defense of the outer cordon as it was not inside their jurisdiction. Shiawase then went on to argue that if the court-ordered laws of the United States prevented them from adequately defending the reactor, something needed to be done. They then went on to explain that they would never presume that the laws of the land be changed for their tiny corporation, but that maybe the laws of the land should not apply within the boundaries of corporate property, and said corporate property should fall under the same extraterritoriality laws as foreign nations and their embassies. The NRC argued extensively against this, but in the end there was nothing they could do to stop the inevitable, as Shiawase based their argument on the same public safety concerns the NRC first brought up. After weeks of deliberation, the Supreme Court declared in 2001 that all major corporations and their properties to be extraterritorial. Soon after, many other nations followed suit. After the attack on the Shiawase reactor, the U.S. government rounded up known members of Terra First, an organization that had its roots in anonymous social media forums of the day. This group became well known to the public as attacks of ecotage became more commonplace. Many independent groups claimed their acts of violence were done on behalf of Terra First. After known members of Terra First were arrested and questioned about the attack on the Shiawase facility, U.S. officials discovered the dead attackers had no actual association with Terra First, and each of them had been paid large sums of money prior to the attack. Terra First later announced they had gathered evidence that Shiawase conspired with other corporations to stage the attack, but before they could release this information, their California office was bombed, destroying all the evidence. When the investigation of the attack was over, U.S. government officials released a statement claiming they believed the Terra First attack was a hoax, though by then no one cared anymore, as the corporations were beyond the jurisdiction of the government and the people have short memories. There are many who run in the shadows who believe the Shiawase attack and the following cover-up was in fact the very first Shadowrun. What do you think, chummers? In deciding this case in the lens of the now and focusing only on the right of Syrtec to conduct its own business, we gravely risk missing the larger picture and overlooking the powerful and most likely negative effects this decision could have on years to come. Democracies are based upon the idea that force should be used as an option of last resort and should only be applied in an even-handed and impartial manner. Corporations, by their very nature, cannot be impartial. They are designed to monitor and enforce their own good, not the common good. By granting them the right to use deadly force, we are taking the first steps towards the futile idea of might makes right. Some will say that this position is alarmist, believing that, as in this case before the court, corporations will only desire to use this power to defend their right to conduct business. This view, however, ignores the rider that's often attached to this phrase, and that is that corporations will use their power to defend their right to conduct business as they see fit. In this case, Syrtec saw the need to have their trucks move in and out of New York City without being hindered by an angry mob, and in this,
their case is fairly sympathetic. But by giving corporations the right to maintain armies without setting well-defined rules for the use of force, we have opened up Pandora's box that will give rise to corporate armies being deployed in any way imaginable. For if history has taught us anything, is that as soon as a particular right or freedom is endowed on the people, there are inevitably and immediately those who push that right and freedom to its fullest extent. When we grant corporations the same rights as nations, we can only expect them to behave as nations have. No nation has been perfect in its decision of when to use force. How much more imperfect will corporations be?